We're going to continue graphing exponentials. What we're going to do is we're going to add a horizontal shift, and the horizontal shift, we'll notice that is with the exponent, and that tells us whether we're shifting the graph right or left. And we're going to fix the table of values based off of that. The other thing is we're adding the number e, 2.71828. We'll talk more about this with the financial math section. We're also adding domain and range. Domain is really easy. It's always the same, negative infinity to infinity. The range is a little bit different based on our positive or negative a value. If our a value is positive, the range goes up. If our a value is negative, the range goes down. So looking at the first example, we're going to state growth or decay. So if you remember from last time, over 1 means growth. So here we have growth. Then we're going to write our horizontal asymptote. That would be y equals -2. It's always our constant value. We're going to come up with our table of values. So x and then y, we have the -1, 0, and 1. If we plug in the -1, it flips the 2. So that becomes 3 times 1/2 minus 2. That would be 3/2 minus 2, which is -1/2. If we plug in a 0, anything to the 0 is 1. So that would be 3 times 1 minus 2. That would be 3 minus 2, which is 1. Then if we plug in a 1, it stays the same. 3 times 2 minus 2. So that would be 6 minus 2, which is 4. So we have our axis. We have our horizontal asymptote being -2. And then with our graph, we have -1, -1/2, 0, 1, and 1 and 4. So this right here would be our graph. Our domain would be -infinity to infinity. And our range, our asymptote is at -2. So we see that it's above the asymptote. So that means that our range is -2 to infinity. Notice there's parentheses, not brackets, because it never reaches the line. It comes close to it, though. Letter B, we're going to do the same thing. We see the 1/2. That tells us it's a decay problem. And our horizontal asymptote, we're not seeing a number, a constant number, so we're going to put 0. When we're doing our XY chart, notice that it has a shift to the right. So how we can tell that is whatever gives us 0, we want in the middle of our table. So 2 minus 2 is 0. So 2 is going to be the middle. We could pick a point that's less than, a point that's greater than. When we plug in a 1, that's -1, meaning we flip it. So that would be -2 times 2, which is -4. Then we plug in a 2. 2 minus 2 is 0. Anything to the 0 is 1. So -2 times 1 is -2. Then if we plug in a 3, 3 minus 2 is 1. It stays the same. So -2 times 1/2 would be -1. We have our horizontal asymptote at 0. Our values are 1, 4 to -2. Oops. Let me redo that because those are negative values. So 1, -4, 2, -2, and 3, -1. Our domain is always the same, -infinity to infinity. And our range, this time it's below the asymptote, so it's going to be -infinity to 0. Remember, the least value always comes first. That's why the -infinity is first. For the next one, what we have is our e value. And remember, that's 2.7. And so that would be growth. We see that our constant value is -1, so that tells us that the horizontal asymptote is -1. We're going to come up with our table of values. What we're going to do is we're going to look at our shift. We see that that +1 tells us it's going to shift to the left one. So -1 is going to be our middle one, and then -2 and 0. If we plug in a -2, what we're going to do is we're going to go e to the -1. So we have 1/2 times e to the -1 minus 1, and we should get -0.8. Depending on your calculator, there's different ways of doing it. -1 means like dividing by 1. So if we had the 0.5, we would divide it by the 2.7 and then subtract the 1. You only have to do one decimal place because we're just trying to come up with an estimate of where we're plotting our point. So for the next one, what we're going to do is we're going to plug in a -1, and -1 plus 1 is 0. Anything to the 0 power is 1. So we have 1/2 times 1 minus 1, which would be -1/2. I'm just going to keep it as a decimal because the first one's a decimal. And the last one, when I plug in a 0, 0 plus 1 is 1, so the e stays the same. So that would be 2.7 times 1/2. And then we subtract 1. And that would be approximately 0.4. So it kind of gives us an estimate of where we're plotting these points. We see that our horizontal asymptote is at -1. And then when we're graphing this, we have -2, -0.8, -0.5, and a +0.4. So it's slowly going up. Our domain is always the same, -infinity to infinity. And our range, notice that it's above the line, so that means that our range is going to be, not 0, it's going to be -1 to infinity. Now, looking at these next ones, we see that this first one is growth because 3 is greater than 1. We see a constant value at -4, so our horizontal asymptote is y is equal to -4. When we're looking at our table of values, we have -1, 0, 1. Line's a little sloppy. So when we plug in a -1, it flips the 3 to 1/3. So I have 2 times 1/3 minus 4. That would be 2/3 minus 4, which is -3 and 2/3. When I plug in a 0, anything to the 0 power is 1. So that would be 2 times 1 minus 4, which is -2. And then if I plug in a 1, what I would get is 2 times 3, which is 6, minus 4, which is a 2. Our horizontal asymptote is at -4. And then when we plot our points, we have -1, -2 and 2/3, -2 for 0, and 1 is 2. If we're looking at letter E, we see the 1/3. That tells us it's decay. Our horizontal asymptote is y is equal to 0 because there's no constant value. When we're doing our table of values, we have 1 in the middle because that's our horizontal translation. Whatever gives us 0 is our middle number. Then we have 0 and 2. So when we plug in a 0, 0 minus 1 is -1, meaning we flip it. So that would be -3 times 3, which is -9. When I plug in a 1 minus 1 is 0. Anything is 0 is 1. So -3 times 1 is negative 3. When I plug in a 2, 2 minus 1 is 1, so it stays the same. So that would be negative 3 times a third, which is negative 1. I'm going to go by 3s in order for this to fit. So this will be 12, this will be negative 12. So 0, negative 9. Pick a different color. And then I have 1, negative 3, and I have 2 and negative 1. My asymptote is at 0, so my line is not crossing that. And for our last one, what we have is the number e. So number e is 2.7. So once again, this is a growth model. Our horizontal asymptote is y is equal to 2. Then what we have is our table of values. Notice that that's a plus 2, so it shifts to the left 2. When I plug in the values, I have negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. When I flip the e and then add 2, I get 2.4. When I plug in the negative 2, negative 2 plus 2 is 0. Anything to 0 is 1. 1 plus 2 gives me a 3. Then if I plug in a negative 1 plus 2 is 1. So it's just e, which is 2.7. And then when I add the 2, that gives me 4.7. So what I'm going to do is move the x-axis down a little bit just to fit everything in. My horizontal asymptote is at 2. And then when I graph the points, I have negative 3 and 2.4, negative 2 and 3, and I have negative 1 and 4.7. My domain is negative infinity to infinity. My range would be 2 to infinity. And that makes me realize I missed the other ones. So let's look at letter D. Once again, pretty easy. Domain is negative infinity to infinity. Our range, it's above, so it's going to be negative 4 to infinity. And then for E, I'm going to do the same thing, except it's going down. So my domain is negative infinity to infinity. And then my range is going to be negative infinity all the way to 0.